Good evening, everyone. I'm Diane Bystrom, and I'm the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics. And on behalf of the 6 co-sponsors, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to tonight's lecture and also introducing our guest speaker. Wayne Wiegand, who is often referred to as the Dean of American Library Historians, is the F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Studies Emeritus at Florida State University and Senior Scholar in Residence at FSU's Palm Center. Prior to moving to Tallahassee, he served on the faculty at several universities, including 15 years at the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He recently served as scholar in residence at Winter Park Institute of Rollins College in Orlando, Florida. In 2011, he received a fellowship from New York Public Library to study its branch library records. He currently serves as president of the Florida State University Friends of Libraries. Dr. Wiegand has received numerous awards for his research and writing in the fields of history and librarianship. In addition to more than 100 scholarly articles, he is author of 6 books and the co-author of 2 books. Tonight he will discuss his most recent co-authored book, and you can see the title right there, Right Here I See My Own Books, The Woman's Library at the World's Columbian Exposition, which, by the way, as most of you know, is also known as at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Through the generosity of Dr. Wiegand and co-author Sarah Wadsworth, all royalties for Right Here I See My Own Books are being donated to the National Women's History Museum in Washington, D.C. Joan Wages, President and CEO of the National Women's History Museum, asked me to convey her greetings and to thank the co-sponsors for sponsoring this important event. She notes that Right Here I See My Own Books demonstrates the impact that the Women's Library has had on women and their place in history. As the first comprehensive library of books written by women from the United States and around the world, this collection gave new insights into perspectives of women's lives and their contributions to society and community. It also gave women who viewed these books and manuscripts a heightened sense of place in society and an increased confidence in their own accomplishments. As Joan notes, it also obviously surprised some men as well. Thus, tonight's presentation is a very appropriate celebration of Women's History Month at Iowa State University. Co-sponsors of tonight's program, which will include a book signing and reception after Dr. Wiegand's presentation, are the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Miller Lecture Fund, University Library, Women's and Gender Studies Program, the Department of History, and the Committee on Lectures, which is funded by the government of the student body. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wayne Wiegand.
From my 15 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I accumulated a nice wardrobe of tweed jackets, and I was looking forward to coming up here and wearing a tweed jacket. I don't get to do that very much in Florida. And your weather has kind of surprised me here. Didn't expect this. I was in Wisconsin yesterday, and the buds on the apple trees are out, which means if they have a hard freeze, the apple crop is gone. I want to thank all of the sponsors for helping to bring me here this evening and remind you that the National Women's History Museum at this point is not a physical entity. It is a group of individuals who have gathered together in order to convince Congress they ought to authorize space somewhere near or on the mall to establish a National Women's History Museum. The common question is, what? We don't have one? So that's how they're trying to address it. At this point, the Congress has authorized a particular site, but pulled back because 2 senators have put a hold on that for reasons unbeknownst to most people. It'll happen, and hopefully, if Joan Wages gets her way, she's a very forceful soul, and she's in cahoots with Meryl Streep, who's a very forceful soul. It will happen by the year 2020, and why would that be a significant date? Okay. All right. May 1, 1893, the city of Chicago opened a World's Fair exposition. During its 6-month run, 27 million guests visited the buildings and studied the exhibits, which displayed cultural products from across the nation and around the globe. Oh dear, I wonder if this is going to be a problem. I did a MacBook There it is. Okay. I did mine on a MacBook Pro, and this is a PC. So if you see some inconsistencies, please don't blame me or throw raspberries or tomatoes, okay? The exposition was a huge success, and ever since, historians have considered it a watershed event in American cultural history. Among the structures occupying space on the Court of Honor that surrounded the man-made lagoon just off the Lake Michigan shoreline was the Women's Building. Good, all right. Which for the first time officially recognized women at a World's Fair as contributors to world culture. Under the direction of Chicago socialite Bertha Honora Palmer of Palmer House fame, can't imagine there isn't an academic who hasn't stayed at the Palmer House, a board of lady managers assembled exhibits from around the world to demonstrate the progress women had made since Christopher Columbus had discovered the New World in 1492. And occupying space in a very large room on the second floor was a library of 8,000 volumes, written, edited, illustrated, or translated by women and representing women from all over the world. Between May 1 and October 30, thousands of fairgoers spent untold hours screening the titles in the Women's Building Library and listed in its catalog. In effect, this collection represented a cultural cameo of books by and about women never before assembled. Women's Christian Temperance Union President Frances Willard remarked when she visited it, had the board of lady managers accomplished nothing else than bringing these books together, it would have been a great deal. Expressing a similar sense of accomplishment and pride, humorist Marietta Holley had the folksy protagonist of her novel Samantha at the World's Fair say, and I hope I can get this right here I see my own books. There they was a-standing up just as noble and pert as if they was to home in the whatnot behind the parlor door. Not a feeling the least mite put out before princes or czars. For Willard, Holley, and countless others, the Women's Library of the World's Columbian Exposition offered a vital counter-narrative to the exclusionary practices of a patriarchal print culture, even as it perpetuated its own exclusions. The women responsible for the creation of the Women's Building Library were keenly aware of the unprecedented opportunity the building offered to spotlight women's contribution to the fine and applied arts, education, family life, service, and other fields in which women had labored. While upholding the underlying construction of true womanhood, the exhibits and events held in the Women's Building sought to extend the range of women's domestic activities into the public sphere. Similarly, the library's interior design reflected both a validation of the feminine values associated with separate sphere ideology, relegating women to the privacy of the home and restricting their participation in public life, and a critique of that ideology. In order to signal the resulting combination of values, femininity, domesticity, and benevolence, but also education, progress, and professionalism, the Board of Lady Managers had paid special attention to the aesthetics of the room. The committee that oversaw the library's design carefully devised a decor that recalled the reassuring solidity and exclusiveness of a well-appointed private library. In taking this approach, the committee departed from architectural and decorating imperatives of mostly male library leaders who, in the 1890s, preferred to emphasize bureaucratic efficiency and utilitarian purpose in planning library spaces. But Candace Wheeler, a nationally known New York textile designer and interior decorator who designed it, had very particular ideas about libraries that emphasized the connection between these traditionally masculine spaces and the feminine sphere of domesticity. In her book, Principles of Home Decoration, Wheeler insists that a home library is not only to hold books, but to make the family at home in a literary atmosphere. Thus, she concludes, the color scheme may and should be much warmer and stronger than that of a parlor, pure and simple, the very constancy and hardness of its use indicating tints of strength and resistance. For Wheeler, Such a room is apt to be a fascinating one, she says, in part because of its variety of uses and in part because of the family treasures it holds. Books, pictures, papers, photograph, bits of decorative needlework, all center here, and all are on most orderly behavior, like children at a company dinner. Moreover, she suggests, the aesthetics of the room should blend harmoniously with its natural surroundings, emphasizing the distinctiveness of its location and environment. Elsewhere in the women's building, Wheeler had felt herself constantly constrained, she said, by the need to take a safe approach to interior design and decoration. But the library allowed her more scope. I felt that both its purpose and its place demanded the use of every appropriate means of beauty, she later wrote. After seeing the nobility of the room's proportions and the one great window which seemed to take in all the blue of the sky and expanse of water which lay under it, I felt it would be an insult into this dominant color to introduce anything in this sheltered space which would be at war with it. Consequently, I chose modulations of blue and green for the color treatment. The library's design apparently achieved the desired effect, that of recreating the atmosphere of a lavish home library within the public space of the woman's building in a manner that harmonized naturally with its physical setting. Maud Howe Elliott, daughter of Julia Ward Howe and editor of Art and Handicraft in the woman's building, praised the domestic character of the interior design. From a purely artistic standpoint, the library is the most important feature of the building. After the Hall of Honor, the room has a character and individuality that we rarely find save in the house of some aesthetic lover of books. There is no single apartment in the whole fair, she says, where the visitor will find himself so pleasantly at home. Equally impressed, the magazine Art Amateur declared it among the very best bits of interior decoration in the fair and described it in terms that suggest an idealized feminine deportment, noting that the whole effect of the room is reposeful, quiet, and cheerful. To Board of Lady Managers Secretary Susan Gale Cook, the room's color scheme was its crowning charm, being a harmonious blending that invited rest and quiet and suggested elegant literary ease. The Shadow Can informed its readers that the large and well-filled library presents a cozy appearance. The overwhelmingly positive response attests to the success of Wheeler's committee in using interior design to project the outward appearance and feminine values of the private domestic sphere onto this very public space. As is intimated by Wheeler's mention of the nobility of the room's proportions, the exhibits and decor cultivated a high cultural elitism along with an elegant domesticity. An elaborately carved 12-foot oak fireplace formed the room's focal point, its openings screened by a custom-made hanging of blue silk brocade woven with a pattern of stylized oak leaves that matched the room's portieres. At either end of the library stood two large standards framed with wings, containing a collection of autographs and documents written by such noble and notable women as Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Mary Queen of Scots, Catherine de' Medici, George Eliot, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. A gilded frieze encircled the walls, and affixed to the ceiling was a large painting by Wheeler's daughter, Dora Wheeler Keith, depicting allegorical figures framed within large oval medallions. Enclosed within a border of Venetian scrollwork, the central oval featured mythical figures representing realms of intellectual endeavor, science, literature, and imagination. Medallions in the corners, connected by images of drapery intertwined with lilies and streamers, framed the literary genres of history, romance, poetry, and drama in a similar allegorical guise. To avoid straining their necks, viewers could examine the images by peering into a mirror placed atop a large dark oak table in the room's center, hand-carved with 16th century designs. Visitors could repose in similarly carved antique oak chairs and sofas upholstered in dark green leather by Associated Artists of New York, a firm Candace Wheeler had founded with Louis Comfort Tiffany. Paneling of the same dark oak lined the walls above the carved walnut bookcases, on top of which, at calculated intervals, specimens of hammered brass and pottery from Rookwood, one of the first U.S. companies owned and operated by a woman, alternated on special occasions with graceful palms. On the walls above the glass-covered bookcases hung portraits of many women whose works appeared in the collection, including early American novelist Charlotte Lennox, and a prominent oil painting of the popular American poet Lydia Huntley Sigourney, framed autographs of women writers and illustrations by Mary Halleck Foote, Kate Greenaway, and other women artists. Wheeler also made sure that busts of notable women by notable women were decoratively used. Chandeliers above, painted wall panels at either end, and a Turkish carpet patterned in red and blue completed the decor. All this was contrasted sharply with other libraries recently erected across the country, almost all of which exhibited busts of famous men whose names and literary quotations were often chiseled into building cornices and whose portraits frequently hung over library fireplaces. In addition to evoking old world stateliness and refinement, the room's decor prominently displayed artwork created by and representing American women. Thus, it implicitly placed the contributions of American women within the context of European traditions, set their work alongside those of the most admired European women, and distinguished Americans among all nationalities represented as meriting heightened attention. In one corner, a 5-foot mahogany cabinet with glass sides and glass shelves showcased an early portrait of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Whoops, that's Pocahontas, I'm sorry. There she is. Copies of 42 translations of Uncle Tom's Cabin, its 2-volume first edition, the latest reprint by Houghton Mifflin, and a beautiful silver inkstand Stowe had received from English supporters. A marble bust of Stowe, still living in 1893 but too frail to journey to Chicago, gazed serenely from a granite pedestal nearby. The library also displayed a few items that alluded to American racial and cultural diversity, such as a portrait of Pocahontas. I'll go back to that. Over the fireplace, and a Hiawatha sculpture by African-American artist Edmonia Lewis. Altogether, I was satisfied, Wheeler concluded. I felt that the women of all America would not be sorry to be women in the face of all that women had done besides living and fulfilling their recognized duties. Most visitors seemed to agree. In late June, a Canadian fairgoer reported to her local newspaper that a whole day devoted to this one room would repay one richly. Frances Willard was effusive. Echoing the rhetoric of progress that pervaded the entire exposition, Willard identified the library as an amazing collection of books written by women that demonstrated a history of women in letters. To Willard, the library revealed this history by showing what a thin, long line it was during many centuries, and how it has rapidly broadened out in a magnificent way since education has opened the door to almost every department of science and art. Board of Lady Managers Rebecca Felton, who in 1922 would become the first female U.S. Senator, observed that the library's very atmosphere became redolent with the greatness of American women in literature and fine art. Written in 16 languages, the library's 8,000 volumes represented women in 23 foreign countries and every U.S. state and territory but 9. No less remarkable, the contributions of each region were assembled and vetted by women in that region, resulting in a collection that was both collaborative, democratic, at least in theory, and generically as well as geographically diverse. Naturally, the states of the eastern seaboard had larger populations and longer traditions from which to draw, but the women of the deep south, the middle west, and west admirably compensated for their smaller numbers in recent settlement by recovering an impressive number and variety of local authored publications. While these texts are overshadowed completely in conventional literary histories, the collaborative, geographically diffuse methods through which the Women's Building Library developed made it possible to re-envision how the women of each region imagined and constructed a literature of their own, simultaneously revealing and reinforcing the primacy of regionalism as a culturally vital category in the print culture of late 19th century America. Mary Lockwood, chair of the Board of Lady Managers committee in charge of the library, reported that 1,453 women around the world had identified and selected 3,000 books from non-U.S. authors, while 2,628 American women, representing 31 of the 40 states and territories, had participated in the identification and selection of nearly 5,000 books by American women. And in the U.S., she said, women across the nation had worked hard to put their collections together. The Board of Lady Managers had declined to put into place any formal mechanism for vetting and admitting contributions to the library. Instead, it was left to the literary committees of the various state and foreign boards to identify, select, acquire, and convey to the Columbian Exposition the literary productions of each region. Inevitably, these contributions varied in completeness and character according to the diverse criteria used to determine inclusion. These criteria range from the broadly inclusive to the highly selective to the seemingly haphazard. New York, which upheld the original ideal of comprehensiveness, sought to contribute works by all authors, native or at any time resident of the state, resulting in a collection of more than 2,000 of the 5,000 U.S. titles. Massachusetts, in contrast, confined itself to one book per author of the best works, while Connecticut considered only authors born in state. Some states, one suspects, sent whatever happened to turn up, while 9 states and territories sent nothing at all. As Lockwood enumerated state contributions, she demonstrated that the Board of Lady Managers had chosen gender to challenge a constrained definition of literary culture in the late 19th century and a concept of library as an agency of that culture that the new profession of librarianship was articulating at that time. As she summarized women's efforts state by state to identify native daughters who had participated in local cultures of print, her report hinted of the many difficulties arising from the fact that women had not been central to the publishing establishment, but rather had operated chiefly on its periphery. The contents of the library frequently tested contemporary definitions of quality. Library professionals of the late 19th century were adamant about the responsibility to elevate the taste of the reading public they served with books endorsed and legitimated by cultural authorities. They operated on the assumption that if their libraries only made good books available to readers, they would make a substantial contribution to solving problems attending immigration, industrialization, and urbanization by enabling the masses to educate themselves, thereby reducing threats to the social order. As Theresa West, who was director of the Milwaukee Public Library at the time, put it, the central idea of the modern library is to help mankind into fuller, freer, more perfect life. This commitment was most evident in the model library the ALA had put together. I hope that shows up. There it is, good. For its exhibit elsewhere on the grounds, a committee of librarians had exercised great care in selecting 5,000 volumes on display. They first computed the average percentage of the total collection found in each subject in selected American public libraries. They then used the Osterhout Free Library of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, as a test collection, checked its entries against standard bibliographic guides and other library catalogs, and sent the pool of possibilities to about 75 libraries for a vote. The results of the vote were critiqued and revised by a panel of subject specialists, including a number of university professors. As Catherine Sharp, director of Chicago's Armour Institute Library and Library School, noted, as a result of this rigorous process, the books now on the shelves of the ALA Model Library represent the thoughtful recommendations of experienced librarians and scholars. As casual observers discovered, however, the Woman's Building Library did not reflect the same commitment to quality literature. In addition to a host of cookbooks, Sunday school texts, and devotional books, the collection included many self-published and privately published texts issued in small editions, along with a variety of various kinds of ephemera, privately circulated volumes such as scrapbooks and manuscript books, and works by popular authors excluded from the ALA's model library. The sensationalist Mrs. E.D.E.N. Southworth, working girl favorite Laura Jean Libby, mystery writers Anna Catherine Green and Mary R.P. Hatch, Sentimental novelists Martha Finley, Augusta Jane Evans, Mary Jane Holmes, and Anna and Susan Warner. These were the Danielle Steeles of their day. Passionate poet Ella Wheeler Wilcox, Girls Series book author Elizabeth Champney, prolific evangelist Hannah Whitall Smith, and many others. Based on statistics gathered from a sampling of American public libraries, the ALA had devoted only 15% of the model library to works of fiction. In contrast, fiction comprised roughly double that percentage in the American section of the Women's Building Library. Although it did not tout the role of gender, the collection of titles in the ALA library nevertheless reflected the political compromises of a male-dominated literary establishment. Huckleberry Finn, for example, was admitted in the ALA catalog owing to the controversy surrounding the novel's suitability for young readers. The titles in the women's library, on the other hand, reflected the political compromises of many groups of women, most of them upper and middle class white women who had a shared interest in putting it all together. Aside from issues of quality, professional librarians could not help but notice other things distinguishing the women's library from the late 19th century public library. First, visitors were not allowed to pull books from the shelves and page through their contents. Closed stacks marked a dated philosophy of service that celebrated the book as artifact and a treasure to be protected. Open stacks increasingly characterized modern library practice and celebrated the book as a useful tool in self-education. Second, the books in the library were arranged first by state and or country. This had been forced on Palmer by the New York delegation. Thereafter, if the state or country's contribution was sizable enough to justify it, by subject. This ran counter to the basic premise of library service, commonly found in a unified subject author public catalog. Dover, New Hampshire Public Library Director Caroline Garland, who also worked half-days in the Women's Library for a month, noted that many of the practices there were not in accordance with advanced library ideals, but it must be remembered that this is not a working library, but an exhibit, and as such should be arranged as artistically as possible. The construction of the public card catalog of the Women's Library reflected additional differences from the model ALA library. Lockwood reported that visitors had access to a partially completed, alphabetically arranged subject author catalog of nearly 9,000 cards that contained two types of entries. One gave statistics of each author represented in the collection and included date and place of birth and death, if applicable, and some information about the author's education and life work. The other gave conventional library information on each book in the collection and contained a Dewey Decimal number. In 1893, the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme, in its second edition, was being adopted by the increasing number of public libraries opening up in communities all over the United States. I'll bet here in Ames, the Ames Public Library was the same way. Lockwood also indicated that librarians present in the room were informing visitors that at the conclusion of the exposition, the library intended to publish a printed catalog of the collections, all arranged in the DDC scheme. While the Women's Library stretched the boundaries of late 19th century notions of culture, not all women's work was fairly represented. When the World's Congress of Representative Women met at the World's Fair from May 15 to 21, two prominent African American women delivered major addresses. Four others commented on presentations. Emphasizing gender over race, I got that wrong. That is the only bibliography of the women's library that exists to the present day. That's it. That's what we had to deal with in order to reconstruct the library. It was if you can see it, author, surname, short title. So sometimes you run across Smith, poetry. So it can be very difficult to deal with. All right, there we go. Okay. Emphasizing gender over race, Frances Harper argued that the United States needed women to stand foremost among the nations of the earth. Fannie Barrier Williams pushed race to the center of her address on intellectual progress and present status as she castigated the white establishment for its sordid legacy of racism. In brief remarks that followed, Anna Julia Cooper noted that the history of African American women is full of heroic struggle, a struggle against fearful and overwhelming odds that often ended in a horrible death to maintain and protect that which woman holds dearer than life. It is not known if any of these women toured the library while attending the fair to check for books by African Americans. If they had, however, they would have found several of Harper's publications, including her novel Eola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, but not Cooper's Voices of the South or Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors, both published the year before, both authored by native daughters of states whose white representatives on the Board of Lady Managers had pledged in 1891 to cooperate with any person appointed to represent the colored people in this state in order that the whole exhibit of our state may be brought out. The board proposes to extend its helpful influence throughout this vast country across the sea around the world, Lady Manager Mary Logan regularly told her audiences. It ignores politics, isms, rank, and race. It is women clasping hands with women. The paucity of text by non-whites in the Women's Building Library reflects the socioeconomic conditions in 19th century America and the extremely limited opportunities available to women of color to write and publish books. Neither the Board of Lady Managers nor the General Federation of Women's Clubs, with their white, Protestant, middle-class biases and exclusionary practices, did much to mitigate the situation or to heighten the visibility of the few texts by minority authors that did find their way into the collection. The Board of Lady Managers refused to grant separate exhibits for women of color, despite the insistence of a prominent group of African American women from Chicago that, under the present arrangement and classification of exhibits, it would be impossible for visitors to the exposition to know and distinguish the exhibits and handwork of the colored women from those of the Anglo-Saxons. And because of this, the honor, fame, and credit for all meritorious exhibits, though made by some of our race, will not be duly given to us. As a result of the board's refusal to cooperate with the Women's Columbian Association, led by African American Letty Trent, and the Women's Columbian Auxiliary, led by African American Mrs. R.D. Boone, any books penned, edited, illustrated, or translated by minority women were merged with the collection as a whole, apart from a handful of books included in the small Afro-American exhibit. That's a separate bibliography, assembled by New York's Joan Imogen Howard. She was deliberately appointed by the New York delegation in order to compensate for the absence of African American women from Southern delegations. From the earliest discussions of the Board of Ladies Managers, the representation of underrepresented groups, initially women, had engendered controversy. To some women, the very idea of creating a separate exhibit solely for women threatened to marginalize them and trivialize their accomplishments. For other women, the prospect of an entire building devoted to high-profile displays of the unique accomplishments of women better served their interests by drawing heightened attention to their achievements, giving them control over how they were to be represented, and providing a physical meeting place as well as a social and ideological nexus for the millions of women who would converge on the Chicago fairgrounds. In private, one lady manager argued that women's exhibits should have been displayed side by side with men. Equally emphatic was an editorial in the magazine Forum that criticized the building for its emphasis on material results rather than women's social relations within the home. Even the imposing collections of books written by women and kept with such devotional spirit in the library of the women's building, it complained, emphasized things temporal at the expense of things spiritual. In this critic's eyes, the effect was merely a humorous one, suggesting as it does the immodest modesty of a New England spinster who once set all the volumes written by men in a row on one side of her library and all those written by women in a chaste seclusion on the other. But not all visitors shared the kind of middle-class values the women's building made manifest. Were these pictures all painted by women? A severe lady asked in early May. I'll warrant you they didn't have families to look after or they'd never have found the time. Upon observing an opera cloak made of prairie chicken feathers, she remarked tartly, "A woman might have found better use of her time." After she had toured the building, including the library, she pronounced, "These things will do for rich people, but if you're poor, you just better not see them at all." Despite minor carping, the Women's Building quickly became a focal point for women who visited the fair. A fairgoer from Paris reported spending many days in the Women's Building, fascinated and never bored. For her, it was without question one of the most interesting places of the entire site. "The Women's Building is now headquarters for the good-looking and high-class young women of the world," the Chicago Record revealed. "Within the four white walls you can see more bright, intelligent faces, jaunty summer styles of the sensible kind, and confident but proper demeanor than you will be able to find anywhere else on a globe, which makes a specialty of studying womankind. It seems that every girl who has studied or traveled or who has any special aspirations gives the Woman's Building a share of her time." Other journalists also took note. "Daily, crowds of the sex which more than outnumber its opposite filled the Women's Building," Isabel Bates Winslow told readers of the magazine Far and Near. And it was in the Women's Building, she said, that by their work, their intelligence, energy, and executive ability, women have won for themselves first rank among all unprejudiced and discriminating people. For some, the building also provided a site for statements on gender politics. At a special service window one day, a visitor asked, "Is this the ladies' building?" "It is the Woman's Building," the employee replied. "Ladies' Building," came a sharp retort as the speaker left the window with an air of having impressed upon the attendant a very great lesson. Why have a library of women's books was a standard question people asked when entering the literary exhibit, cataloger Edith Clark recounted. Why not let them take their place side by side with men and be judged equally with them? In her own mind, Clark told a Chicago Library Club after the fair closed, the reason was obvious and could be summed up with another question. Why not? The Wisconsin Historical Society collected materials written by Wisconsin inhabitants, she said. Schools and colleges acquired works written by alumni, and many men regularly collected books addressing their hobbies. Most of the library's visitors, Clark noted, came from small towns and county districts, and most, male and female, had seen women occupied only in housekeeping and the rearing of children. Once they entered the library, however, many were amazed when they are brought face to face with the achievements of the same abilities when brought into competition with men in art, literature, science, or business. And often they remark, Clark says, "Why, I did not think there were so many books in the world written by women." Clark also reported that the literary critic and reformer Thomas Wentworth Higginson had spent a couple of hours there, and because he was so impressed with the remarkable library of women's writings, he said, offered to donate his own 1,600-volume collection of women's works if the proposed women's library ever materialized in a permanent building. Numerous other testimonies echoed Clark's experience. Caroline Garland later reported that one woman, attended by a sedate colored servant, delivered her book in person. "It is the story of my life," she explained, adding that the book had changed the legislation of 32 states. As a young woman, she had been committed to a madhouse by her husband in order to take possession of her property. But after 3 years' confinement, she had escaped, found friends, wrote books, and then made successful application to the states for better legislation in regard to the insane. This book joined 2 other exposés by the same author, Elizabeth Parsons Ware Packard, on the shelves of the Women's Building Library. Many newly published women authors also visited the library. They were, as a rule, hopeful, Garland observed, and entirely free from the vice of modesty. She recalled one who gave her a book she had written. "You'll read it, won't you?" When Garland responded, "If I have time," the author snatched it out of her hand. "I won't leave it if you don't promise to read it." Garland confessed that the librarian's desire to increase the size of the library got the better of her truthfulness, and she promised the author she would read it. Garland also recalled a visit from Virginia Smith Jones, who donated a 2-volume set of illustration of the nests and eggs of the birds of Ohio. This was hand illustrated. At the time, it was valued at $375. For today, it's probably in the tens of thousands of dollars, which she had worked on with 8 years of untiring industry, she said. When Garland asked, "How did you ever have the patience to complete it?" Jones responded, "I did it in memory of my daughter. She had just begun to work when she died. So for her sake, I made it as perfect as possible." The Woman's Building often left an indelible impression on fair visitors, and those who described their glimpses of the library were undeniably impressed by the sight that greeted them. So far as possible, its collections of books and manuscripts shows what women have done in literature in all times and all lands. The exquisite carving of the bookcases, the handsome wall decorations typical of the arts, science, and literature, all the results of women's thought and labor, the Shadow Can reported. The bookcases themselves surrounded the room, filled with books, a great army of them, beginning with the very earliest utterances of women in print and following down the centuries to the present, building decorator Candace Wheeler recalled. Highlighting a handful of British authors in this mammoth collection, Harriet Martineau, George Eliot, Frances Burney, Lady Jane Grey, Jane Austen, and Charlotte Bronte, Minneapolis journalist Marion Shaw echoed Wheeler's imperialistic metaphor, a great army of books, when she pronounced that the library gave indisputable evidence of women's inherent right to occupy the field of literature, since in this department she has come, seen, and conquered. The Women's Building Library functioned as cultural space, inviting the exchange of social capital to its hundreds of thousands of visitors. Over the course of the fair's 6 months, the library was differently appropriated as a site and as a collection of printed materials. One female visitor used its comfortable furniture to breastfeed her baby. Others used it to make statements reflecting gender politics. "Yesterday, my attention was directed in the library to an interesting exhibit," the editor of Woman's Tribune noted in her July 7 World's Fair Letter column. "Autographed letters and portraits of noted women are placed under glass on a revolving stand. It would be impossible to give a complete list of letters in the collection, but among them were one or two from George Eliot, George Sand, from Queen Elizabeth to Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Lucretia Mott, and Lydia Maria Child, etc. She marveled that sightseers should spend so much time in admiring laces and needlework rather than study this collection, which gives an insight into the character of these great women. Historians have concluded that the Woman's Building demonstrated a desire to construct a closer balance between women's private and public lives, and at the same time to profile contributions women were making in their public lives. Having separate space in which to cultivate this balance also fostered gender solidarity and an enlarged sense of womanhood, and facilitated on a very large scale the kind of female institution building and networking that women's clubs across the country had undertaken in the late 19th century. The library constituted a record of a public sphere manifesting an increased democracy for some women, newly included, but at the same time silently imposing boundaries outside of which others continued to reside. Yet despite obvious class, race, and nativist biases, women who visited the Woman's Building probably came away with an enhanced sense of achievement and inclusion in the public sphere. The Woman's Building Library contributed to that sense of accomplishment and belonging. As a collection produced by women and judged by a jury of women's peers, the library presents a richly detailed cameo of the culture of print constructed by participants in the late 19th century women's club movement, a movement Estelle Friedman calls one of the largest manifestations of social feminism at the time. In addition, the library reflected significant changes in conventional thinking about library space. Although Andrew Carnegie's turn-of-the-century philanthropy stimulated a movement that soon made the American Public Library a ubiquitous civic institution, in the vast majority of communities, much of the impetus for starting these libraries came from women's organizations. The thousands of women's clubs members who visited the Women's Building Library in Chicago, and I'm willing to bet a month's Social Security check, I can't do the regular check part anymore, a month's Social Security check, The Women's Club here in Ames, Iowa, went to the Chicago World's Fair, and they saw the Women's Building Library, and when they came back and got the Carnegie grant, the interior decoration they observed with Candace Wheeler was part of how that building was arranged. I'm willing to bet a month's Social Security check on that. Okay, so although Andrew Carnegie's turn-of-the-century philanthropy stimulated a movement that soon made the American Public Library a ubiquitous civic institution, in the vast majority of communities, much of the impetus for starting these libraries came from women's organizations. The thousands of women's club members who visited the Women's Building Library in Chicago and subsequently returned to their communities to help establish the public libraries Carnegie money made possible particular ideas about how those libraries should look inside and out, responding to Candace Wheeler's effort to make visitors of the library feel at home in a literary atmosphere, she said. The intense emotional and intellectual connection fostered by the social nature of reading that club women had experienced at home was easily transferred to the Women's Building Library. Many visitors to the library undoubtedly sensed an imagined community that the titles lining the bookshelves facilitated, one bound to some extent by time and geography, but to an even greater extent by gender. Equally important, the library represented an unprecedented landmark in the charting of women's literature as a vital cultural enterprise. At the same time, the celebration of women's important role in international print culture, together with an anti-canonical inclusiveness that validated the work of thousands of little-known women writers, conveyed a powerful image to the women who visited the library. Surveying the contents of its shelves, these women could join Marietta Holley. Oh, there's the Women's Building Library. There are only 2 pictures of the Women's Building Library that survive. And as you can see from this, the library was used for meetings. Women would come, smaller groups would use that room for the meetings. Larger groups would use the lobby area for the meetings. Okay, well, there's my British authors. I'm behind. I'm sorry. There's Marietta Holley. Okay, so Marietta Holley writes this note, and she declares, with mingled wonder, humility, and pride, right here I see my own books. Okay, that concludes it, but I want to get into a couple of things here. Sarah and I developed a database of the contents of the library, and you can find it at that website right there. And I invite anybody to go in there with the thousands of possible questions one can ask of that. I'm going to give you some indication of this. Last Friday, we had a colloquium on this book in which 5 female faculty members at Florida State University looked at the contents of the library. A historian looked at it for history of women in the library. Another one looked at it for Southern writers in the library. And it's as interesting to ask the question, what's not there, as what's there. And another one did science in the library. Women had a particular way of explaining science to audiences that was not typical of the way men did it. And those books tended to find their way into grade schools and high schools, as it was explained. Now, on the other hand, the foreign language titles, a friend of mine at Rutgers University is editing a volume of essays by women who are looking at the collection from an Italian perspective, from a French perspective, from a German perspective. And I remember vividly the French person, the one who's looking at it, said, I don't recognize any of these authors. So what the canonical literature that has come down to the present generation of students isn't necessarily in this library. There are a lot of people in this library, if what I'm hearing from other authors is any indication, who have never been studied before. Why are they there? And on the other hand, why aren't some of the canonical authors who we study today, why aren't they there? It's a fascinating question, which also goes to how canonical literature shifts over time. Now, a major point I want to make, my friend Ed Gedekin will tell you this. For the longest time, library professionals present company excluded, of course, library professionals wanted to make their buildings very professional looking, almost sterile and antiseptic. All right? And I'm currently doing a book on the American Public Library from the perspective not of the user in the life of the library, but the library in the life of the user. And when you turn that around, you discover that people use libraries differently, many times differently than librarians and library trustees think they do. But you got to turn that around. So in the course of doing research from the perspective of the user on the American Public Library, I have unearthed hundreds of voices who remember their library fondly. And tell me if I'm not echoing your own sentiments about the public library as that you used. And I'm willing to bet 80, 90% of you used public libraries as kids. They remember the homey atmosphere. They remember the flowers on the circulation desks, the pictures on the bulletin boards, the flag that's over the circulation desk. They remember elements that have to do with connecting to that atmosphere that they revered so much at home. That's what they remember. Yes, they remember the books, but it's the homey atmosphere. It's the homey atmosphere that the Women's Building Library can take credit for in the Carnegie Public Library movement that came out of the late 19th, early 20th century, and they have never gotten credit for it. Okay, so I'll be happy to take questions.
I have a question. You can bring the microphone in the back and take your question. So,
I don't know if we need a microphone. What happened to the books and everything?
Yeah, the New York collection, which was nearly 2,500 volumes, went back to New York State Library. Melville Dewey was the state librarian. He's the guy from Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme. He helped put this thing together. It was his minions who staffed it. And he insisted if the New York women are going to put it together, it's going to come back to Albany. And that's where it burned in 1911, when the entire library burned down. So a third of the collection was lost in that fire. A lot of the books went back to their points of origin because people wanted them back, and that's okay. But about 3,000 of them hung around in Chicago and were shunted from place to place. And in the 1930s, they were brought out. First, Newberry had them for a while, and then the Chicago Public Library had them for a while. And in the 1933 World's Fair, they were brought out once more. And Theodore Koch from Northwestern University saw them and said, "Can I have them for my women's collection at Northwestern?" And that's where they ended up. Now, tomorrow I'm going to Chicago, where the American Library Association and Northwestern University are sponsoring an event like this to help launch the book. And, of course, the National Women's History Museum is going to be there, and we hope lots and lots of profile. But I have to tell you, you can get any of the books that Northwestern got on interlibrary loan here at the Iowa State Library. They're on the open shelves. And Sarah, my co-author, I did the history part of this. She did the analysis of the collection from her perspective part of it. And she would simply ask for copies of the book on interlibrary loan. And these books from the 1870s and 1880s with the book plate from the Women's Building Library would come to her desk. I want those things off the open shelves and in a special collection. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
And one more. How was it funded? Who paid for the building and the books?
Oh,
Bringing the books
that's an interesting question that involves the politics of funding. Money came from Chicago, money came from the federal government. And then that money was brought to a supervisory board which allocated resources. Now, if Bertha Potter Palmer lived today, she would be Secretary of State. She was a savvy politically savvy individual. She's described as an individual whose southern vowels rolled off her lips. All right, I mean, but spine of steel. When the men didn't give her the amount of money she thought was due the Women for the Women's Building, she marched right into their offices and said, "You're going to do this." And they did. I mean, they just buckled to her. So that's how the money came for the building. The building itself was designed by, I think, I'm trying to remember how old she was. It was designed by a woman, first graduate of MIT's architecture school, and I think she was 21 years old. Yeah. There's only one building that survived, and that's the Field Museum. Everything else it was not erected to survive. It was erected for a 6-month World's Fair. And after the fair closed, there were vagrants got in and fires, and Chicago finally decided to tear it down because it's more trouble than it's worth. Yes, sorry. I can't give you that information. I regret. But I'll bet you can name 5, and I'll bet among those 5 they're there. Yes. And I can. No, because you'd guess immediately. But I will tell you, one of the senators objects because on the website of the National Women's History Museum, one of the 323 biographies is of Margaret Sanger. I thought that, yeah. Go figure. Yes, Ed. Yeah. The historical data comes largely from the Board of Lady Managers papers at the Chicago Historical Society, and those are voluminous. The detail I got was when Bertha Potter Palmer and Melville Dewey corresponded. There was a moment in 1983 when I was doing the Dewey biography, and I saw this and I thought, First Women's Library. I had to get up and walk around because I was so excited at that. So it's between those two that you get most of the primary source material. But outside of that primary source material, that bibliography that we've redone into as complete a bibliography as possible, that's where the real story resides. We just told you the history, and we gave you an angle of vision or two on the contents. But Iowa State University students in women's studies, you could take that book as the historical background to this, go into that database and ask all sorts of questions. I was thinking of science, women's sciences. You know, who's there and who's not. I could see seminars, several seminars on this campus just doing that very thing. And I don't, maybe you have these materials, maybe you don't have these materials. My fondest hope, some of you may have heard that the Library of Congress has resurrected the Library of Thomas Jefferson. That's how the Library of Congress got started. Congress bought Thomas Jefferson's library in 1815. There were a lot of people who didn't like that. It was politically controversial at the time. My fondest hope is that somebody rebuilds this library and puts it in the new National Women's History Museum. That would be neat.
We have a question over here. So, did Carrie Chapman Catt visit the exposition?
I can't document that. I can't imagine she didn't, however. I know she was in the building.
I know that Stella Bass Mansfield was there. She was the first woman lawyer in the country from Iowa. And she was, I've read something that she was at the women's building. We did that tour of Chicago.
Which is another dimension to looking at that collection. Someone with a legal background, I'm not mentioning, maybe Keith, history. Someone with a legal background, take a look at what's in there that has to do with women in the law. I try to convince Cheryl to do it, but she's not interested. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. One of the things that we've done here at Iowa State is we create, we've got an original list of Carrie Chapman
Yeah.